Welcome back, folks, to Consider This. I'm Melisa, Idris, with Sharaad, Kuttan. And tonight on Consider This, we're going to be looking at the political developments that had taken place in the past couple of weeks and how that had revealed the underbelly of Malaysian politics for a certain group that is seen to be the future of this country. How are young people reading this crisis, and will they be turned off from future political participation? We have joining us in the studio Qyira, Yusri and Tharma, Pillai, co-founders of the youth empowerment organisation Undi 18. Tharma and Qyira, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so I think let's begin with a sense of what your main takeaways have been from the political crisis of the past couple of weeks. I mean, especially in terms of how it affects young people, how have you made sense of the chaos? Tharma or Qyira, who wants to begin? Tharma.
So for me, I think that it was a very unfortunate crisis that was created purely because of certain personal interests of certain politicians. And I think people could see that. I think a lot of young people saw that these people or the main actors were not fighting for their needs or fighting for their interests. They were very real, right? You're looking at severe economic crisis. People are worried about a recession. People are worried about the coronavirus and how it's having a global impact, not just to Malaysia. There's multiple levels over here. And these people are doing it at the worst time. Literally, when we are about to announce our stimulus package, and then you do this, drop our economy by about 4 billion. So I think there's a lot of anger and frustration among young people across the political divide.
Okay, do they see this as something that was happening because of politicians? That politicians as a kind of species tend to be self-centered and self-interested, as opposed to a generational issue, saying, well, this is all about old people, and in particular, older men. Qyira.
Yeah. I think it's definitely a mix of both, right? So, so it's nice that you said SPM results today. My students got their results today.
Oh, yes!
So I think when I speak to my students, there's a lot of confusion, firstly, and I guess the feeling of being left out, right? So all these power struggles, power grabs, party hopping, these are not issues that young people, especially if you're not politically engaged, would be able to understand very easily, right? Because they'll be like, why are you suddenly different parties today and then different party tomorrow? And then they'll be like texting me and they'll be like, Miss, what's happening? Like, what's going on? Who's in which party now? How do we vote in the next general election? Will there be an election coming up? Okay. So I think it's a very, the events in the past week, it just become so complex for young people. And I think it's just a dangerous, disappointing thing to happen for the Undi 18 generation.
Well, you know, you make them watch, Consider This, and make it compulsory for a pass in your class.
Compulsory viewing.
Political education.
Just to come back to that, you said that it is a complex situation to understand. And because you speak to a lot of young people, what are some of the competing narratives that are shaping young people's understanding of this crisis?
I think it's what the politicians have been telling to the media and indirectly to them, right? All the reasonings you hear from politicians are, we're doing this for you, we're doing this to keep the country stable. I mean, if it's stable, then why don't we have a cabinet, right? Why do politicians hop parties and things like that? And I think for a lot of, I guess even my peers even, right? Let's not even talk about the younger generation, is that they just feel very frustrated. They just feel very powerless. Whether you voted or not voted, it's very obvious that this is not something people could see happening. People didn't predict that this kind of immature power struggle would happen at this point, at this juncture in time, like what Tharma mentioned earlier.
Tharma, so do you think a lot of young people saw the Pakatan Harapan government in terms of the ways that Pakatan itself saw itself as, you know, making a break from an authoritarian past, providing a future, especially in terms of the reforms it was promising, and of course the Undi 18 reform was a key component of that, was one of the big legislative wins of the first year of government. Is that how young people see Pakatan, or is it just a Pakatan self-image?
So, to be very fair, I think there were significant differences in depending on you're an urban person or versus you're from a rural environment. I think as we're well aware, there's also that contrasting narrative of like, oh, they're taking away Malay rights, they're challenging Islam and all that stuff. So I think there was the reform agenda that was seen as somewhat valid, and also the competing agenda of, oh, they're taking away our rights. But I think more importantly, more fundamentally, when there was that change of government, people believed that, oh, we are in a proper democracy, and regardless of whether I'm liberal or conservative, my vote matters. And therefore, in the next election, I'm going to vote for a government I believe in. I think that was something that was very important, but that got destroyed over that last week. That's unfortunate.
Well, you know, before we kind of proceed any further, I think it's important for us to kind of disaggregate this idea of youth,
Yes.
right? The
Yep.
Young people. We can't just make an assumption that young people are this singular monolithic block.
Exactly.
Right, exactly.
How would you disaggregate youth? I mean, what are the cleavages that we need to understand when we talk about what young people want?
For me, I think it's basically trying to understand sociology in general, right? Because young people are very much divided between urban and rural youth.
Yeah. I think social class is always
social
the
class
the
is very big
factor,
difference. Also looking at what are their ethnic, because in Malaysia our language that we use is so important.
Okay.
People who are English speaking, Malay speaking, Mandarin speaking, Tamil speaking have completely different worldviews in terms of how they see things. So I think these cleavages are very obvious even amongst the youth. But I do think there's one thing that can unite young people, the focus on economics, because that is a very primary concern for everyone, regardless of what part of that cleavage you're in.
Okay, what about, Qyira, the question of Sabah and Sarawak? Because the narratives there also been very different,
Yep.
especially the kind of positioning
Yep.
that Sarawakian politicians have taken. And do you have a finger on the pulse of Sabah and Sarawak, or is your group mainly kind of peninsula-centric?
So I grew up in Sarawak. Actually, I grew up in Miri. So it's been a couple of years since I went back. But I'm sure you guys know the political scene in Sarawak, Sabah is obviously very different, right? They see themselves they see themselves very separate from federal ongoings. And from what I understand, with my friends from my hometown, is that it's also they see it as a Semenanjung problem. You know, all these arguments is between old Malay Semenanjung men, right? It's not really something that really applies to them until GPS became a kingmaker in this situation. So I think it's also a very unique position that puts Sarawak voters, especially when it comes to the especially the upcoming state election. I don't know if we called later or called earlier, but I'm very excited to see how young people will vote for the Sarawak state election, because I think that would really show what you're feeling in regards to all of this.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I also want to come back to a couple of things you said. So you used words like powerless and feeling of disappointment and disenfranchised, the feeling of being disenfranchised.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that will lead to a certain apathy towards politics. Whereas a competing narrative that I've seen on social media has been this call for more representation. In fact, a youth political party.
Yes.
I mean, are we saying that the youth wings of our current political parties is not enough representation?
We've gotten a lot of call-outs
Yes,
to
that's
start
right.
a youth political party. But my personal opinion, I think a youth political party is not sustainable. Because what happens when you hit 30? Do you just retire? Right? And also, I think for political parties to be successful, you need to have a grounding ideology, right? And that's what most political parties, or they claim to have. And I think, but what we need to look at when it comes to youth representation and youth empowerment is how do political parties empower the young people within their current party structure. I think similar to with women as well. Do you actively mentor women? Do you actively put youth in positions of leadership, even within the party? Do you actively field youth for leadership positions? So I think this is the proper question that we need to ask within our political culture instead of a youth party.
Tharma, you know, when Syed Saddiq became the youngest minister in the region and so on and so forth, there's so much that was, ink was spilt on that particular factoid. Do you think young people cared? Were they as excited as media people about the fact that Syed Saddiq was one of the youngest ministers in the world?
I don't think the fact that he was the youngest was a big deal for a lot of people, but having a young person being represented and who could listen to their voice was very important. Because if you notice, he was the only one among the many ministers who was on the ground. You could feel the heartbeat and the pulse through social media. If anyone had any issue, even if it's completely unrelated to his ministry, they'll be like, let's tag Syed Saddiq, because you know that he will read social media and he will be able to respond. So I think that sense of connection within a generation, because we speak the same language, we communicate the same way, and our interests are somewhat similar. I think that was something that was so important, and that's why representation matters, isn't it? It's not about being that record of youngest minister. It's about, can I see myself in you?
Do you think this can be replicated in the Perikatan national government?
I hope so, but it's going to be a bit tough because their youngest MPs are 40 years old. maybe someone can correct me, but when we looked at it, their youngest were about 40 years and above, so they do not have young MPs. So unless they
They could
bring
just
in,
change the definition, couldn't they?
Youth to be 40.
Yes, or up to 50, whatever you like. I mean,
they
You
could.
would be the head of the youth wing.
no, actually, I'm a little past it, but thank you very much for that endorsement.
All right, I'm going to come back to
Yeah.
Tharma and let you finish that thought,
Yeah.
but we're going to take a quick break, continue shortly after this on Consider This.